in swallowing dust of graveyard of empires. History has written itself. Today we will take a look at Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviet-Afghan War was a pivotal conflict with far-reaching consequences for both Afghanistan and global geopolitics. To fully understand its significance, we must delve into the historical and political context that led to this tumultuous period. Afghanistan, a landlocked nation in Central Asia, had long been characterized by its rugged terrain, tribal societies, and historical resistance to foreign invaders. The country's strategic location made it a potential target for global powers seeking influence in the region. In the late 19th century, Afghanistan played a great game between the British and Russian empires, as they vied for control over Central Asia. By the mid-20th century, Afghanistan had begun to modernize under King Mohammad Zahir Shah's rule, although its social and political systems remained deeply rooted in tribal and ethnic dynamics. In 1973, a coup led by Zahir Shah's cousin, Daud Khan, overthrew the monarchy and established a republic. In April 1978, a faction of the Afghan Communist Party, known as the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, staged a coup against President Daud Khan's government. This event marked the beginning of a radical transformation in Afghanistan's political landscape. The PDPA's leadership was divided into two main factions: the Khalq faction, led by Nur Muhammad Taraki, and the Parcham faction, led by Babur Karmal. The PDPA's reformist agenda included land redistribution, women's rights, and modernization initiatives. However, their methods were met with resistance from conservative elements within Afghan society. Land reforms disrupted traditional power structures, and the rapid pace of change alienated large segments of the population. As discontent grew, so did the resistance to the new government. By 1979, a growing insurgency, composed of various factions including tribal leaders, religious figures, and disenchanted civilians, had coalesced into a movement opposing the PDPA regime. This movement became collectively known as the Mujahideen, meaning holy warriors. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, led by General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, was concerned about the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. The Soviets feared the potential spread of Islamic fundamentalism and sought to maintain a friendly, socialist government in Afghanistan. The Khalq faction's close ties with the Soviets made them appear as a natural ally. In December 1979, fearing that the PDPA government was on the verge of collapse, and influenced by reports of an imminent CIA-backed coup, the Soviet Union made a fateful decision. They launched a full-scale military intervention, deploying tens of thousands of troops into Afghanistan. The Soviets aimed to prop up the PDPA government and stabilize the country under a communist framework. The invasion, however, had a profound impact on the international stage. It triggered a global outcry and prompted the United States and other Western countries to condemn the intervention as a violation of Afghan sovereignty. The event strained relations between the two superpowers, leading to a significant escalation in the Cold War tensions. The Soviet-Afghan War's origins lie in a complex interplay of internal Afghan politics, the radical agenda of the PDPA, and the Soviet Union's geopolitical concerns. The stage was set for a decade-long conflict that would see Afghanistan plunged into a brutal war, with the indigenous Mujahideen forces fighting to expel the foreign occupiers. The first part of our series has laid the groundwork for understanding the events that would unfold in the years to come. As we delve further into the conflict's progression and consequences, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan sparked a fierce and determined resistance movement. The Mujahideen, a diverse coalition of Afghan factions, united by their opposition to the Soviet presence, launched a guerrilla war against the occupiers. These factions ranged from tribal militias to Islamist groups, all sharing a common goal of liberating Afghanistan from foreign influence. The Mujahideen's tactics combined traditional hit-and-run strategies with modern weaponry, often supplied by Western countries and other regional powers that opposed the Soviet Union. This period saw the birth of the Afghan freedom fighters, who managed to inflict significant casualties on Soviet forces. The conflict in Afghanistan quickly became a focal point in the broader Cold War struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States, along with its allies, began providing financial and military support to the Mujahideen. This support was funneled through intermediaries, including Pakistan's intelligence agency, the Inter-Services Intelligence. The CIA's covert program, codenamed Operation Cyclone, aimed to undermine the Soviet occupation by arming and training the Mujahideen. This marked a significant shift in the nature of the conflict, as Afghanistan became a battleground for proxy warfare between the superpowers. The Soviet Union, led by General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev until his death in 1982, struggled to suppress the Mujahideen insurgency. The Soviet military employed a range of tactics, including large-scale offensives, airstrikes, and efforts to win hearts and minds through development projects. However, these tactics often alienated local populations, and the Mujahideen's intimate knowledge of the terrain made them elusive targets. The harsh realities of the Afghan terrain, along with the dedication of the resistance forces, turned the conflict into a grueling and protracted struggle for both sides. The Soviet military faced logistical challenges, including adapting to the rugged landscape and countering the Mujahideen's hit-and-run tactics. As the war intensified, Afghanistan's civilian population bore the brunt of the suffering. The conflict led to widespread displacement, with millions of Afghans fleeing their homes to escape the violence. Many sought refuge in neighboring Pakistan and Iran, where they lived in refugee camps under challenging conditions. The war's impact on civilians was exacerbated by the destruction of infrastructure, disruption of basic services, and loss of livelihoods. The Soviets' attempts to modernize the country clashed with the traditional ways of Afghan society, creating tensions and further alienating the population. The period from 1980 to 1984 saw the Soviet-Afghan War evolve into a full-blown insurgency, with the Mujahideen gaining traction and international support. The United States and its allies escalated their involvement, turning Afghanistan into a battleground for proxy warfare. The conflict's human toll continued to rise, affecting both the Afghan population and the Soviet military. In the next part of our series, we will delve into the later years of the war, examining the changing dynamics and eventual withdrawal of Soviet forces. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union faced leadership changes, with Mikhail Gorbachev assuming power in 1985. Gorbachev inherited a war that was becoming increasingly unpopular domestically and was draining valuable resources. His policy of glasnost and perestroika meant a shift in Soviet strategy in Afghanistan. Gorbachev sought a political solution to the conflict, aiming to stabilize Afghanistan under a friendly government, while gradually reducing the Soviet military presence. This marked a departure from the previous approach of using military force to suppress the insurgency. In April 1985, Gorbachev announced the start of a phased withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. This withdrawal was designed to be gradual, and was accompanied by efforts to bolster the Afghan government's military capabilities. As Soviet forces began withdrawing, they faced increased pressure from the Mujahideen, who saw this as a sign of weakening resolve. The Mujahideen launched a series of offensives, hoping to capitalize on the reduced Soviet presence. The withdrawal did not bring an end to the conflict, but rather intensified the fighting in some regions. Throughout this period, efforts to find a political solution gained momentum. International actors, including the United Nations, attempted to mediate between the Afghan government and the Mujahideen. The Geneva Accords of 1988, brokered by the UN, aimed to outline a framework for ending the conflict. Under the accords, the Soviet Union agreed to a complete withdrawal of its troops by February 15, 1989. The United States and Pakistan, in turn, agreed to stop arming and supporting the Mujahideen. The Afghan government, led by President Mohammad Najibullah, who had replaced Babur Karmal, was meant to participate in talks for a transitional government and eventual elections. Despite the withdrawal agreement, the conflict in Afghanistan did not end with the Soviet departure. The Mujahideen remained divided along ethnic and ideological lines, making it difficult to establish a unified front. This internal fragmentation hindered efforts to form a stable post-Soviet government. As the Soviet Union withdrew, Afghanistan plunged into a period of chaos and civil war. The vacuum left by the departing Soviets led to power struggles among various Mujahideen factions and an ongoing fight against the government forces loyal to Najibullah. The years from 1985 to 1988 marked a turning point in the Soviet-Afghan War. The gradual withdrawal of Soviet forces, coupled with shifting international dynamics, set the stage for the conflict's next phase. The Geneva Accords raised hopes for a political settlement, but the complexity of Afghanistan's internal divisions and the ensuing power struggles would continue to shape the war's trajectory. Following the Soviet Union's withdrawal in February 1989, Afghanistan was left in a state of turmoil. The Afghan government, led by President Mohammad Najibullah, struggled to maintain control as various Mujahideen factions fought for supremacy. The power struggles, fueled by ethnic, ideological, and personal differences, resulted in the continuation of violence and instability. The international community's attention waned as the Cold War ended, further complicating efforts to find a resolution to the Afghan conflict. Many factions that had received support during the war now turned on each other, leading to a fractured landscape. Najibullah's government managed to hold onto power for a few years, thanks in part to continued support from the Soviet Union, which provided limited assistance. The government focused on consolidating its control over key urban centers, while the Mujahideen operated mainly in rural areas. As the government's grip weakened and internal divisions deepened, the situation became increasingly dire for Afghanistan's civilian population. The country's infrastructure crumbled, and the economy suffered due to the ongoing conflict. Amid the chaos and power struggles, a new force emerged: the Taliban. Formed in the early 1990s, the Taliban were a conservative Islamist movement primarily composed of ethnic Pashtuns. They gained support from certain segments of the Afghan population, who were exhausted by years of conflict and sought stability. The Taliban's initial aim was to restore order and impose their interpretation of Islamic law in Afghanistan. They quickly gained control over significant parts of the country and enforced their strict version of Islamic governance. In 1992, the Afghan government's internal divisions reached a breaking point. Amid a power struggle between Najibullah and his rivals, the government eventually collapsed. This led to the end of communist rule in Afghanistan, but it also left a power vacuum that intensified the fighting. The Mujahideen factions, despite their shared goal of toppling the government, failed to agree on a unified vision for Afghanistan's future. Instead, they turned on each other, leading to further instability and violence. By 1996, the Taliban had gained control over the Afghan capital, Kabul, effectively establishing their rule over much of the country. The Taliban's strict interpretation of Islamic law and their suppression of women's rights and cultural expression drew international attention and condemnation. The Taliban's rise to power marked a turning point in Afghanistan's history. While they initially brought a semblance of order to parts of the country, their policies and practices would later contribute to their isolation on the global stage. The period from 1989 to 1992 witnessed the collapse of the Afghan government and the rise of the Taliban, bringing an end to years of conflict but also heralding a new era of challenges. The internal divisions among Mujahideen factions, the emergence of the Taliban, and the continued instability underscored Afghanistan's complex and fraught journey toward a new form of governance. In the next part of our series, we will explore the Taliban's rule, their relationship with extremist groups, and the international response to their regime. After seizing control of Kabul in 1996, the Taliban rapidly expanded their influence across much of Afghanistan. Their rule was marked by a strict interpretation of Islamic law, which often resulted in harsh restrictions on personal freedoms and human rights, particularly for women. Music, art, and entertainment were banned, and the education of girls was severely limited. The Taliban's policies and practices led to international condemnation and isolation. Only a few countries, including Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, recognized the Taliban regime. During their rule, the Taliban provided sanctuary for various extremist groups, including Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden had previously fought alongside the Mujahideen against the Soviets, and he established a base in Afghanistan to further his global jihadist agenda. The presence of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan raised concerns among many countries, including the United States, about the potential for the country to become a breeding ground for international terrorism. As the 2000s began, international pressure on the Taliban regime intensified. The United Nations and human rights organizations condemned the Taliban's treatment of women and their support for extremist groups. In 1999, the UN imposed sanctions on Afghanistan in an attempt to force a change in the Taliban's behavior. Meanwhile, the United States, along with other countries, engaged in diplomatic efforts to persuade the Taliban to extradite Osama bin Laden. The Taliban's refusal to do so heightened tensions between the regime and the international community. The turning point came on September 11, 2001, when the United States experienced a series of terrorist attacks orchestrated by Al-Qaeda. The attacks, which targeted the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., resulted in nearly 3,000 deaths. The U.S. government quickly determined that Al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks and that Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan. In response, the United States initiated the War on Terror, with the primary objective of eliminating Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. In October 2001, the United States, along with its allies, launched a military campaign in Afghanistan, known as Operation Enduring Freedom. The goal was to remove the Taliban from power, dismantle Al-Qaeda, and bring stability to the country. The military campaign, supported by Afghan resistance forces known as the Northern Alliance, quickly toppled the Taliban regime. Kabul fell in November 2001, and the Taliban retreated to rural areas, where they continued to launch attacks against Afghan and coalition forces. The aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War and the subsequent conflicts have had a profound and enduring impact on Afghanistan's political, social, and economic landscape, as well as on international relations in the region. The legacy of these events continues to shape the challenges and opportunities that Afghanistan faces today. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please share it, like it. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. See you soon in another video.